already I've had time to review Cy Hersh's bombshell report on the Nordstream 1 pipeline bombing, and it's pretty spicy. Now, the only knock, before I get into the only knock that I have seen about this report is people saying, well, it's a single anonymous source. But hey, the legacy media does this all the time. Almost every story that you see in the gold standard Washington Post and New York Times is a single anonymous source. More often than not, an intelligence official, some low-level spook, some kind of special agent, something or other. So, other than that, I have seen no holes poked in this story. So with that said, let's get into what Cy Hersh is reporting here. Now, Cy Hersh, for those of you who don't know, he's an old guy. I don't know his exact age, but he's been around a long time. He reported on the My Lai massacre back in the Vietnam War. So he's been around a time or two. And so presumably this is a guy who might know a couple of folks. Unlike, the 22-year-old recently hired WAPO reporter telling you about how the Hunter Biden laptop is a Russian psyop, sources say, Cy Hersh does not have to sleep with people to get his sources. And he also is smart enough to where he is not going to just be fed propaganda and then launder that propaganda via his platform. And so he has more credibility than your typical WAPO or New York Times reporter. He's probably the last person that a spook would go to launder propaganda. Now, you could make the same case against this Cy Hersh report that people tried to make against Project Veritas and James O'Keefe, and there's news about that, but I don't have time to get into Project Veritas today. But at the time when the Project Veritas Pfizer expose came out, people thought this is too perfect. It must be a honeypot. But the argument against the Project Veritas story being a fake honeypot from, either Pfizer or some spook or some other establishment figure, is that the effect of the Project Veritas report was to make people, a lot of the public, think that Pfizer actually said these things. A lot of people, the vast majority of people probably, who saw Project Veritas's video thought it was real. And so if you think of it from the perspective of, let's say, Pfizer, does it make sense for them to try and plant a fake story like that? No, because it's a fake story that makes them look bad. And if later they come out and say, hey, this was a honeypot, we faked it, James O'Keefe published fake news, people are just going to think, a lot of people who saw the video are going to think, oh, that's just Pfizer trying to deny it. So it wouldn't have helped Pfizer to try and set James O'Keefe up in that scenario. And so likewise, I think in this case, you could say, oh, well, how do you know that this isn't some spook trying to feed fake news to Cy Hersh in order to discredit him? Well, if Cy Hersh publishes this report and then the CIA comes out and denies it, which, of course, happened, that's what everyone would expect. Nobody is going to think that the CIA is going to come out and say, oh, you got us, Cy Hersh. That was us. And so even if this was a fake story that the CIA made up in some sort of 4D chess move to plant in the media, it doesn't work as effective propaganda because it's propaganda that works against the CIA and the White House. So on to the story itself. In this, Cy Hersh details that this was basically a plot that was known by very few people. It was a very high-level plot. It involved the White House, Victoria Nuland, specifically the American Viceroy of Ukraine, and the CIA. The CIA used some Navy divers out of Pensacola, Florida, to plant C4 on the Nordstream 1 pipeline, only to detonate that C4 months later. And furthermore, in order to make sure that as few people knew about this plot as possible, the CIA did not go through the Navy SEALs and Special Operations Command, because apparently the covert actions of SOCOM have to be disclosed to Congress. I think through the Armed Services Committee or maybe the Intelligence Committee. I forget which, but I think it's one of those two. But either way, there are some members of Congress who would have to be told about this plot if it were to be routed through Special Operations Command and the Navy SEALs. So they used non-SEALs from the Navy. They used just regular old Navy divers. So they got some low-level guys, and of course, they compartmentalized, I'm sure, and they were not, they were only told whatever they absolutely needed to know. That's how information works in the government and the military. And as cover for this plot, they used some widely publicized training mission in the North Sea that the U.S. Navy was doing. And so the U.S. Navy was in this area, and while the U.S. Navy was doing its thing, while they happened to be over Nord Stream 1, these divers jumped off the boat, went down to the bottom, and they planted C4 on the pipeline. Now, it would have been too obvious if the pipeline had blown up, if they had some kind of timer and, within 30 minutes of the U.S. Navy boat passing over Nord Stream 1, the pipeline blew up, that would be too obvious. So, supposedly, they rigged it to detonate at some point in the future. I think it was a remote sort of thing. I forget how exactly the detonator worked according to this, but it didn't really matter. What matters is they detonated it, I believe, in September and planted them in June. And so there was they had a lot of time between when they planted them and when they detonated them. And so that makes it even harder to trace between the two, recovering their tracks. And this, in a way, is not really news, because this is what those of us in the know, as soon as this happened, the number one suspect was the United States of America. It didn't make sense for anyone but the USA to blow up the Nord Stream 1 pipeline, because if you're Germany, the Nord Stream 1 pipeline is how you get your natural gas supply, which fuels your economy. If you're Russia, the Nord Stream 1 pipeline is how you deliver gas to your biggest customer, Germany. And other than the two parties that are actually involved in the pipeline, the only other country that really had the capabilities to do something this insane was probably the United States. And the USA has been very much against the Nord Stream pipeline forever. They hate it. The U.S. did everything they could to shut down Nord Stream 2, even though it was completed. It never came online. And they wanted to do everything they could to break the economic relationship between Germany and Russia, because that relationship prevented Germany and Russia from ever really becoming true enemies, because they had such a strong mutual interest. Germany had an interest in securing cheap energy, and Russia had an interest in securing a reliable customer. And as what was Friedman's old phrase, where goods do not cross borders, armies will, or maybe it was the inverse. The U.S. was basically using this same logic here. They wanted to stop the flow of trade between Russia and Germany, and so they blew it up. And now that that's been blown up, well, then what's been the talk about since then? Well, it's been building up the talk of war with Russia. Before, war with Russia was unthinkable because, oh my gosh, Europe's gas supply comes from Russia. Europe can't go to war with Russia. Well, now Europe's already lost their Russian gas for the most part. There's the Druzhba pipeline, which is still flowing to Hungary and some other countries. But as we all know, Hungary's voice does not matter in the European Union. The people who really make the decisions, they've already lost their Russian gas for the most part. And so the decision to engage in a suicidal war against Russia is now in their hands. And so since this report is just an anonymous confirmation of something that those of us who are skeptical of America's role in the war in Ukraine, something that we already believed. How is this relevant? Because the people who, have the Ukraine flag abbeys, they're not going to be convinced by Seymour Hersh and an anonymously sourced article saying that America blew up the Nordstream 1 pipeline. So how does this make a difference? How is this going to be anything significant in the course of the war or the narrative or anything like that? Well, I think that the significance here lies in the level of detail. There's such an extensive level of detail in Hersh's reporting that he must have had an extremely high-level source, because there were only so many people who knew about this plot. And it would have to be one of a very few number of people to have given him this level of detail of how the entire plot was laid out, if indeed, this is an accurate story. Now, in trying to judge whether or not that this is true or false or something made up, you can look at a number of things. One of it is there an incentive for someone to plant this fake story in order to discredit Seymour Hersh and maybe critics of the idea of war with Russia? I've already ruled that out, I think, for the same reasons that I ruled out, the honeypotting of Project Veritas. And so the second thing you have to consider is, could Seymour Hersh have just made this up? Did he just do this to get attention? Frankly, Seymour Hersh is an old man. He's had a long and storied career. I don't think that he really has any incentive to destroy his credibility so late in life. I think that he has a legacy to worry about. And so I don't think that, and this is a judgment call, I don't think Seymour Hersh would make all this up. And there's such, again, it's such extreme detail that he would have to go through a lot of work to come up with this whole concocted tale, because this does sound like something out of a Bond movie. And so with that said, I'm leaning more towards this being true than not true, even though we don't have proof yet. I'm just using my judgment. This seems, the circumstances around this point to this report being true. And so if that's the case, who could be Seymour Hersh's source? Considering that this was routed around, this was laundered to avoid Special Operations Command, which is all the high-level secretive stuff. Typically operations like this go through SOCOM. Considering it was so secretive that they didn't even let them know about it, because that would have alerted some members of Congress. And as I said before, the divers involved, I'm sure, knew nothing of what the high-level people were talking about. The divers themselves would have only known, okay, you're supposed to get off this boat here in the North Sea, dive to the bottom, and plant this C4 on this pipeline. The divers probably weren't even told that this was Nordstream 1. They were just told, hey, there's this thing down here, we're going to plant some C4, then you come back above, the boat, we're not going to detonate anything, and go on your merry way. The divers, wouldn't have known when the thing blew up that, hey, that was what we planted bombs on. We planted in June, it blew up in September. They wouldn't know how the bombs were detonated. They wouldn't, I wouldn't think, I guess maybe they'd be familiar with the technology of the bomb that they were placing down there. They would know how it could have been detonated. But anyway, then you move next up the chain. Well, I'm sure they had a CIA handler with them on the ship, who was actually running this mission, and the divers were just the grunts doing the grunt work. That CIA agent, I think maybe their handler might be the lowest level person who could be Seymour Hersh's source, because maybe he knew enough about. But then again, I don't think that he would know about the involvement of the White House and all this, and maybe the agent, the CIA agent, would know, hey, we went around SOCOM, we used these Navy guys because we didn't want Congress to find out. I think that that's reasonable, that a low-level CIA agent working on this mission could have known that. But again, the stuff about the White House, I don't know how they would have known that. And considering, again, I'm trying to take everything into consideration, so I'm overusing that word. Forgive me, I've probably said it 15 times in the last 5 minutes. They want to keep this to as few people as possible. So I don't think that there was this is just my gut. I don't think that there would have been a huge chain of command that this would have worked its way down. I think that probably the director of the CIA would have had a pretty close hand on something like this. I don't know how many people would have been between the CIA director and whoever the handler was who was managing these Navy divers. I think there's a possibility that it could have been a direct thing. Like, it might have been straight from, hey, there was this agent handling these divers, and he reported directly to the CIA director. I don't know how the CIA works, but I'm just saying that that doesn't seem crazy to me. Because, again, the goal here clearly, based on the story we're being told, was to make sure as few people knew about this as possible. And so, outside the CIA, other sources would have had to have been someone very high up in the White House, Victoria Nuland, Tony Blinken, perhaps. Joe Biden probably didn't know. If he was told, he probably forgot. Jill Biden, I guess, could be a source. I could see Jill knowing about this. Not Kamala. Nobody would have told her. So, anyway, my point is, there's only so many people who could have been Seymour Hersh's source. So, back to something that I brought up in the beginning, people knocking this for being a single source story. When only a handful of people know that this went on, you're not going to find confirmation from multiple sources. It's insane to think that on something like this, if true, that he got even one source, because who's gonna sing, who's gonna quack about this? The whole point is to limit who knows about it so that you don't have multiple people who might step forward and tell a journalist about it. The goal here is to make sure that nobody tells a journalist about it. So you would only have the most loyal and dedicated true believers involved in a plot like this. And so the reason, the thing here that people should be taking away from there being a single source is not that, oh, he only had a single source. It should be, wow, he managed to find any source. And so, from Seymour Hersh's perspective, normally journalists want to have multiple sources because that makes your story look better. And it looks bad when you print single source stuff that's normally taboo in journalism because, hey, you might just be being manipulated. Someone might just be feeding you a load of garbage. But in this case, since we've narrowed down, there's only a handful of people who could have known about this plot. The person who told Seymour Hersh might have been high level enough to make this credible on its own as a single sourced story. I mean, think about it. If the director of the CIA came to you as a journalist and said, hey, remember that pipeline between Germany and Russia that got blown up mysteriously? Yeah, we did that. If you have the director of the CIA admitting that to you as your source, I think I would be comfortable running that. Because this isn't a single source story where you have a spook telling you, hey, I did this really great thing. You should write a story about it. This is something that if the CIA director or somebody else in the CIA is telling Seymour Hersh this is something that makes them look bad, not good. And so the higher up the source is, the more incentive they have to keep this hidden, not to reveal it. And if you remember, in Watergate, Woodward and Bernstein's source, Deep Throat, was actually the director of the FBI. Now, in that case, it was because the director of the FBI wanted to take out Nixon. The FBI and the deep state were not fans of Nixon. And so something similar might be at play here. I'm not saying that the CIA is trying to take out Biden or something like that, or Victoria Nuland. We don't know. There's all sorts of internal politics. All we know is that if this is true, someone very high up is blowing the whistle. And I'm sure they have their own ulterior motives. I'm sure it wasn't just an attack of consciousness. Just like the FBI revealing Watergate, they wouldn't have done that if Nixon was someone who they felt like they could work with. The FBI used Watergate as leverage to get rid of Nixon and replace him with someone who was much more compliant, in the form of Gerald Ford. And so I don't know if there's a similar ulterior motive in this case, but I'm just saying that there could be. It's not impossible that someone involved in this plot has some reason now, at this late date, for exposing it. And some good news, this has caught the attention of at least one U.S. Senator, Mike Lee, who had tweeted about it last night. And so maybe there will be some follow-up to this. Mike Lee was pretty good on Yemen. And so it'd be nice to see him delve into this a little bit. Because this was an act of war, I believe, against Germany and Russia, committed by the United States. I said that at the time. Seymour Hersh's reporting, confirms my bias. So, there is that. But again, this is something I already believed. And if we get more evidence, if there is any sort of investigation, perhaps led by Mike Lee, that reveals, hey, we committed an act of war against Russia, maybe there would be less sympathy towards this whole idea that we need to go against Russia because they're a big bully and they're the aggressor and everything. Maybe this would cause the public to stop and think, because remember, this whole idea of supporting Ukraine and getting ourselves involved in a war with Russia is already unpopular. But if we find out that the deep state is committing acts of war behind the voters' backs, I don't think that will help their case. So with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.